Friends, good evening, good afternoon, good morning from whichever part of the world that you guys are joining from. Welcome to the fifth session of our Masterclass in audio series. We are delighted and honored to have Peter Qvortrup from Audionote, UK. Just to give a brief of the session in terms of the protocols, the session will be around 90 minutes with 60 minutes allocated for discussion and approximately 30 minutes allocated for Q&A towards the end. Please mute your audio and video if you have not already done so. Questions for Peter can be posted in the chat window on the right-hand side of the Zoom panel. You can see there's something called as more out there. And if you just drop it down, you'll see one particular window for chat. So you can post your questions on the chat window. If there's any question relevant to the ongoing discussion that we are having with Peter, I'll take that question. I'll post it to Peter right then and there. And any other questions can be answered towards the end of the session. So without further ado, let's welcome Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hello. So,
yeah.
What would you like me to say?
Just to give a small background, Peter is a highly acknowledged and well-regarded veteran in the subject of high-end audio. I would request Peter to give a glimpse of his journey in the audio industry to start off with.
Well, that'll take the full hour. So what are we going to do after that?
You can be a bit brief if that works.
Well, I mean, I think certainly for my part, it starts with a keen interest in music. As I was growing up, my father listened to a lot of classical music in the early 50s, when I was quite small. And I've sort of retained that interest, probably a little bit more than perhaps is healthy. But, one can always look back at one's life and think that there might have things have been different. I think really I have a great interest in history and the history of music, the history of audio, and the history of all sorts of other things. And as I grew up and I started learning more about and understanding better who is famous and why are they famous, and then you listen to artists that are not famous, and then you think, well, why are they not famous? They're actually much better than the people that are famous. This doesn't make any sense. You come to realize that people that are good at self-promotion and people that are good at choosing the right platform to shout their messages from. We have a perfect example sitting in the US at the moment. I shall say no more because it'll get depressing after this. They seem to be able to, especially as mass media have become more and more commercial and sort of dominant, that really being able to influence people's thinking without people really being able or allowed to think about why they are being influenced this way is actually quite an interesting thing to watch and to consider. So anyway, when my journey started, when I went into audio, I originally intended to become a medical doctor, but I failed the maths exam. In Denmark, you have to sit quite a difficult maths exam to get into medical college. And I diligently failed maths exam 3 times.
Okay.
And which did my self-esteem no end of good. Or maybe not. I then decided to take an apprenticeship at the world's largest shipping company called Maersk, AP Moller. And I spent 6.5 years there, finishing my apprenticeship, and then I ended up sitting at the oil brokering, at the minerals brokering desk. We brokered in other things as well as oil and refined products. And I decided that that was just the most boring thing I'd ever. I would lose my will to live if I stayed doing that. So I quit and started my own company, because my main interest by then was really music, and I'd started dabbling a little bit in importing hi-fi from various small manufacturers in the UK. I think it was 1974. I'd been to London and been to the Hi-Fi News show at Heathrow, and I met several small manufacturers there that were very nice and had equipment that I thought sounded sort of reasonable. I opened a shop in 1979, which I still own, and that shop basically now is one of the three biggest hi-fi specialist hi-fi shops in Scandinavia. I basically spent most of my money from when I opened the shop on buying equipment from all over the place and listening to it to see whether I could get a handle on what constituted better. And that took a while and cost quite a lot of money. And then I stumbled across sometime in 79, I had helped a friend empty a system out of an old cinema, which landed me with a pair of amplifiers and some very, very large speakers and things that I had difficulty finding anywhere to store. It was in a Western Electric system, or Westrec system, because it came from the Western Electric arm of in Great Britain. And when I finally got these amplifiers to work, it came as a considerable shock to me that they were much, much better than what I was selling. So I decided to, when I went to the UK next time, I decided to buy quite a lot of old equipment from the UK to see what that sounded like. So I bought old quads and old Leaks and various other brands, lesser known brands like Audiomaster, Lauder, and a few more. And having restored them, I came to the conclusion that they were actually much better than what I was selling, which was kind of depressing, because what it demonstrated was that the idea that we were progressing in a real way was actually wrong, that we were regressing, and we were producing, not we meaning me, but the hi-fi industry as a whole was producing equipment that really wasn't as good as it had been in the 50s and 60s and earlier. So I sort of started a historical journey for several years, which culminated in me setting up a complete Western Electric 16A system in my apartment in Copenhagen, which was on the 5th floor, and it was carrying this shit up the stairs. There was no lift. Was quite a painful experience, apart from the fact that it took gouges out of the walls because these things were so big. But once I got that set up, that used field coil drivers, the 555, and I can't remember what the base units were called. I sort of came to realize that really all the specialist hi-fi was really deficient in some very key areas. The Western system was collared because it was designed for very large environments and to be listened to at a certain distance, and my living room wasn't big enough for that. But I learned some important lessons from that. And over the preceding years, up till about 1983, I'd listened to and purchased pretty much everything that was available that looked interesting. And it's one of my favorite topics when a reviewer tells me he's found the best speaker he's ever heard. And, you know, the question that I always ask them is, okay, so have you ever listened to an Ohm F or a beverage system 2 or a Heil air motion transformer? And Oscar Heil designed a full range speaker with Heil drivers, which was very interesting. I don't think it's particularly good by the today's standards, but certainly by my standards of today. But it was damned interesting. Or the Alan Hill plasmatronics, and of course none of these so-called and very highly regarded reviewers have even heard of these products. So how they can make a judgment, a sort of a very final and absolute judgment on what they consider to be the current state of the art is actually really questionable in a fairly major way. But anyway, I've sort of continued this historical journey, if you will, of looking at parts, of looking at different design philosophies, different technologies, which is really how I've ended up where I sit now, you know, impoverished and confused. Not. No, but basically, how this developed after I left Denmark in 1983, and then I spent a few months in the US helping a friend in LA who had a shop on Sunset Boulevard. And then I went back to the UK and basically and decided to start what was called a company called Audio Innovations, with the intention of reintroducing affordable valve amplification. Is never cheap if it's any good, but affordable amplification. And we did that quite successfully. I sold the company, well, I sold chunks of the company to partners to finance it because it was so successful. And in the UK, as may be the case in the US, I don't know, but in the UK, it's very, very difficult to borrow any money for an expanding company. So you have to bring in investors. And that's really unhelpful because the investors then gang up on you and kick you out if they don't like the way you run the company, which is exactly what happened. So they took over the company and it went bust within 3 years because they had no idea what they were doing, which is both, you know, you sort of feel aggrieved initially and then you think, well, it serves them right. But then at the end of it, you realize that was actually, it was quite sad because it you know, it destroyed a perfectly viable company if it had been managed better. In '89, this was in 1990. In '89, I'd been working with the Japanese Audionote company for quite a few years, starting in 1979, and that collaboration had developed into a sort of an almost worldwide collaboration by 1990. And by then I was selling Audionote worldwide, and except in Japan, where Audionote obviously is based, and it was more sensible for them to sell it there. And we did really well, considering that we were working during a period of quite severe economic hardship in the early 90s. We did very well with these products, and we developed a homegrown product range in support of the Japanese products. We got to a point in the mid-90s where I felt that we needed to, or the Japanese needed to, develop their products further. And that met with quite a lot of hostility. At the same time, we were running into problems with the trademark and the brand name because we were seeing people register the brand name all over the world: Australia, Italy, Austria, the US, even in the UK. So after some fairly heavy-duty arguments, I persuaded Mr. Kondo that we needed to register the trademark. And he signed the trademark over so that we could register it, because he was not willing to pay for the registration. And it's quite expensive to register a brand name and a trademark across the sort of 30 largest markets or 40 largest markets in the world. It's $100,000 affair plus. We then get to 1997, 98, and the disagreements with the Japanese over which direction we should take technologically had started expanding quite rapidly. I wanted to take the company in a different direction to the way they were making their products. We presented them with a couple of prototypes, one of which became the M10 that was made in Japan, which has won awards all over the place, and justifiably so, I think. And Mr. Kondo got really quite offended by this. So in '97, then we had the big currency crisis in Southeast Asia, which really put us on the back foot financially, because Southeast Asia was by far our biggest market. And as it happens, it still is. So nothing's really changed. It's just moved to China now instead of being Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam and so on, and Taiwan and Korea. And so we basically, Kondo-san decided he didn't want to continue to work with us, and so we canceled the agreement and went our separate ways. And a lot has been said in that regard on various discussion forums, but at the end of the day, you know, from the business perspective, I think the argument was not well conducted by the Japanese. But moving right along, we then end up with a company in about 2000, 1999, 2000, which has essentially got its own identity, if you will. All the products are produced in the UK. During the 90s, we added loudspeakers and a broader range of cables and turntables and various other things to the product line. Because my belief has always been that unless you control the entire system, you cannot actually predict what you're likely to get when you put a record on and the sound comes out the speakers. By having a complete system, one, you are of course responsible for the end result. So if the end result is bad, then you only got yourself to blame. The mix and match approach that is so very popular in the high-end market, really, as far as I'm concerned, is a complete nonsense. Because there is no way of, you know, I mean, the analogy I always use is that you take a gearbox from a BMW, an engine from Mercedes, the front suspension from a Ferrari, the differential from a Lexus, and then you try and put that together and get something that, you know, does something that doesn't kill you when you put it on the road. And the likelihood is that it won't. It will kill you. And that is really how the audio market works now, that, you know, people will buy speakers from one manufacturer, amplifiers from another, cables from a third, a front end from a fourth, and then they'll sit and try and get that to work. And really, it's the best I can say is that no system sounds better than the worst component. So you really, what you're doing is it's a race to the bottom. The worst part determines how bad the system is. In a sense, it's a bit like the traffic in Mumbai. You know, that the slowest participant on the road determines how fast everybody else moves. I think that might be recognizable for at least the ones of you that live there. You know, we have a similar problem here in London. It's just the same. So you know, I've sort of over the years I've looked at I've cast the net very wide. We've looked at technology. I've looked at technologies that go back to the 1920s and before. I've spent huge amounts of money and time on experimenting with equipment or with older equipment, with older valves, with older parts. And what I've learned is that the industrial processes that we use and have used over the last 50 years to make parts that are more consistent, parts that are smaller, parts that are cheaper, that these processes really do not produce parts that are suitable for use in quality audio equipment. And since nobody else makes parts that are any different, the only way to do it is to have them made for yourself, which is exactly what I've done. It's taken many, many years. It's cost a vast amount of money. But I'm pleased to say that we are sort of approaching, we can begin to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a train coming the other way. I hope it isn't anyway. So, we basically, as the only manufacturer in the world, we make everything from the ground up. We make the parts, we design the equipment, we do the metallurgy in the parts. We spend a great deal of money experimenting with processes to see whether there's a difference in the sound of processes. And then we at the same time get to listen to quite a lot of music, which is great. You know, how can that not be good if your main interest is in music? But as far as music is concerned, again, you know, the history is very important there. You know, we are as a species, we are fascinated by complexity. You know, it's like it's almost like the sort of IQ tests that we've developed are more suitable for people that have very complex thought processes than very simple ones. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the people that fall through the net, if you will, of these tests are very often people that are more creative and create a much more interesting, or have much more interesting thoughts on what things should look like than people that have I mean, nowhere is this more obvious than in the financial system. I mean, you laugh. No, but seriously, I mean, if you look at, you know, I have some customers very high up in the financial system, and you sit over a drink with them and say to them, okay, so explain to me how this works. And they go, oh, no, you wouldn't understand. It's like, I'm pretty smart. Why don't you try me? You know, I can understand most things and I can deduce them down to their core elements. So, and what's interesting is that most of it is just bullshit, as it is with so many other things in life. Anyway. No, so my sort of the driving force in what I've always done, or what I've done up to now, and that won't stop, is really that I see the equipment as being the servant of the music. Equipment really should be invisible musically. Of course, it never will be. You know, the best you can do is reduce its influence on any given recording as much as possible. What you cannot do is remove it completely from the equation, because then you're back to live music.
Mhm.
And who the hell can get 160 member orchestra in their front room? I don't know many people that can do that. So, you know, we deal with miniature versions of very large events. If they're well recorded, they will give you a believable and musically authentic representation of what was there. And in many cases, they don't. But that doesn't mean you don't like the performance. You may not like the sound, but then the sound again is really the packaging of the performance. Just like the idea that the sound staging and imaging and so on is somehow an important ingredient. And you know, it's one of these things that it's very difficult to get people to, or to get customers to understand that, particularly with modern recordings, there really isn't any of this on the recording, because the recording was done with each member of the band. If it's an orchestra, it's done with 37 microphones, one microphone over each section of the orchestra, and then it's all put together. So you have these fragmented bits that are all put together in the mixing and mastering process. And hey, here comes my lunch. Thank you very much. And so the idea that this somehow is an important part of the performance, in my modest opinion, or maybe not so modest opinion, is that it's just nonsense. It is completely and utter nonsense. And what it does, particularly, and has done in the high-end industry, is that it disqualifies the entire musical heritage from pre-1955, before stereo. And given that certainly in classical music, and to a large extent with jazz, that the vast majority of the really valuable part of our musical heritage sits in the mono catalog and in the 78 catalog. It seems absurd. It seems absurd for an industry to favor ways of listening and ways of evaluating quality that disqualifies some of the most important and interesting documents in the musical catalog. I fail to understand this. I mean, I've had this discussion with quite a lot of the most famous reviewers over the many years I've been doing this, and I never cease to be baffled at how little they actually know about how, you know, what went before stereo. And also, interestingly, how little they know the discussions that took place when we went from the original Edison roll to the flat disc, to the 78, or what happened between when we went from the acoustic recordings to the electric recordings in the mid 1920s. And those discussions are actually very important to understand how our view of what music is and how it should be reproduced, and what what is important in how music is viewed as a sort of as a cultural artifact, if you can call it that.
Right.
No, I'm now gotten out of breath.
Okay. I just have a question which came up with regards to what you were talking about. So when you say processes which are influencing the sound, do you actually are you talking about something like with respect to the neutrality or something like that with respect of the song? This question actually is posed by Arnold.
I think neutrality is a very loaded word, Karthik. I think the problem with the vocabulary that we use to describe audio and to describe sound, it is really misses the point. You know, accuracy, what the hell does that mean?
Accuracy, true.
You know, neutrality, what does that mean? Now, I prefer words like authenticity. I developed the sort of, you can call it the philosophical foundation of how I've evaluated whether a piece of equipment or a resistor or a capacitor or an entire system, how well it does its job. And it's on an article, on a piece that I wrote together with a friend of mine called Leonard Norwitz, in the early 90s, and it's called Are You on the Road to Audio Hell?
Yes.
And basically the idea there is quite simple, that we do not know what is on the recording, because at the end of the day, we don't know what was picked up by the microphones. I mean, we know what the piece of music is, we know who the artists are, but we cannot with any certainty say that the microphones did, or the rest of the equipment in the recording process did the job that we expected them to do. Therefore, from that, it follows that the only thing that we do know about recordings is that they must have a different sonic signature. Now, that sonic signature has little to do with the music. It has to do with the way the recording sounds. And so instead of using an evaluation system, which is by and large you could call comparison by reference. Now, what is comparison by reference? Comparison by reference is where you sit down with a number of known recordings and you then play those on an amplifier, pair of speakers, piece of cable, whatever. But the mere fact that you use these records as a reference means that you assume that you know what is on
it's supposed to be. What's on the record.
And you can't possibly know that. I mean, you can know, I mean, there are a lot of things you can know. You can know the music, the artist, and so on. You can know that this recording is better than a lot of other recordings in the presentation. But what you cannot know is precisely how the recording sounds. And this is where comparison by contrast comes in. If you take, which is how we tend to develop these products, the products we make, and all the parts that we make and design, is by taking 5 or 10 random records, and then we listen to them to see whether a given piece of equipment or a circuit or a piece or a resistor or capacitor or whatever, whether that makes the recording sound more different, more individual from from the other circuit, amplifier, speaker, whatever. And that's actually quite easy to do once you've learned how to do it. But you have to unload a lot of this audiophile nonsense that is so enormously dominant, most of which, of course, comes out of the United States, as so much other wonderful culture does. I will say no more. And you have to get rid of that. You have to get rid of this idea that, oh, I know what the violin sounds on this record, or I know what the piano sounds on this record, you know, or I listen more to where in the sound field the instruments are, in spite of the fact that you don't actually know where they are.
Oh.
I mean, the mere fact that you use more microphones actually creates a problem in the timing of how instruments sound together. There's a very famous test that I think it was Dick Olsher that did this test originally, but I'm not quite sure, where they took the latest re-release of Ella Fitzgerald, Clap Hands, Here Comes Charlie. And they compared, I think it was the analog recordings, analog productions with the original stereo. And then they compared it to the original mono. I have all three, so I can do exactly the same comparison. And it's very interesting when you listen to the timing, because it's quite a small band. It's like 4 pieces or 5 pieces in the band and her voice. It's very interesting when you listen to the mono, that because you have the microphone in one place, all the sound from the different instruments arrive around about the same time. When you have several microphones on the stereo, you get a very, very subtle change in the timing in the way the instruments play together. And you can hear that. You have to have quite a good system to hear it, but you can hear that. So that then begs the question, why did we get stereo in the first place? Because they knew this. I have early discussions from the technical department of EMI, where there was a lot of discussion about this. And this was one of the points that the recording engineers made at the time. So what they were saying was, what we really need are stick to mono, but just 2 speakers, 2 amplifiers, but they play mono. We just play mono. Now, I've done tests at shows over many, many years where I will play the mono version. I will have the stereo jacket for the record, but I have the mono version in it. And then I will play the mono version. I will put the stereo jacket up so that people can see what's playing. I have never had a single complaint that they didn't sound like stereo.
Peter, I have a question from a gentleman, Mazban. Can you unmute yourself and ask the question? In fact, it's a series of questions which are all related. So, Mazban, if I can request you to unmute yourself and pose the question to Peter directly.
Can you hear me, guys? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
You're very audible, Mazban. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Peter, the thing is that, you were talking about people changing capacitors and resistors and trying to make kind of understand or hear the difference of these components make, because we really don't know what's on the recording. So what is the reference material that one needs to balance or bias all? I mean,
that does not have a simple answer.
No, because what I'm trying to say is, this all would also depend on the person, on the ears of the person who's making those changes, right? So what's good for the goose may not be good for the gander. Like you might say, okay, this brand fancy new capacitor makes the sound so good, but to me it must be sounding like crap. Maybe there's a problem in your hearing, and that's why you change that capacitor. So shouldn't there be some kind of measurable metric, is what I'm saying? Like, shouldn't there be a frequency response plot, or maybe a phase response plot, maybe an ETC or an impulse response, which actually tells us, look, this going through this capacitor is so clean, or it is so dirty, or it has got this kind of roll off or not. And based on that, we should make decisions, not on because it sounds good, or it's got some air, or it is, all these fancy words that audiophiles use to describe.
That's part of the problem. And this is why if you study the comparison by contrast method in more detail, one of the things you'll realize, especially if you hear a system that's good at presenting the contrast, it becomes pretty obvious what it is you should be listening for. And I mean, I've tested this on dozens and dozens and dozens of people over the years. And I would say what is very interesting is that I would say that most of the people that respond well to this do not carry too much audiophile baggage, i.e. they're listening for parameters that they know. They have this expectation of imaging or sound staging or whatever it is. Now I have a record. I'll see if I can find it there. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
This record is one of the more interesting recordings to own. In fact, I just got the CD in.
Okay.
It literally arrived as we speak.
Okay.
What is interesting about this record is that it is clearly described in the text on the back where in the sound field the instruments are, how far back they are, and so on. And this allows you a much better, you know, all things being equal, allows you a much better way, or you know, a very effective way, should I perhaps say, of judging what your system's actually doing. Because it's quite easy to make for example, a loudspeaker that presents imaging in a certain way on a multi-mic recording. All you have to do is have a slight raise in the energy band from somewhere between 2 and 5 kilohertz. That's where a lot of this information sits. So if you have a frequency response that looks like this, and that sits in that area where this particular information is dominant, then you get better imaging and sound staging. But at the end of the day, all of this is packaging of the sound. It is not the sound itself. And that's where I think the industry has completely and utterly lost its way, that it's incapable of, what should we say, prioritizing what is it that matters. You know, when you speak to musicians, I have a number of quite well-known musicians on my client list, many of whom or several of whom have become friends over the years. When you sit and talk to them, a lot of them have started out going, yes, but all this matters. And then you play them systems, and then you start playing them old recordings from 78s, particularly recordings from the acoustic era. Now, what's special about those recordings? Well, the most special aspect of them is that what should we say, that the distance between the man singing into the horn and the membrane with the pin that cuts the sound into the lacquer is very, very short. So the distance between the actual event and putting it down to document is very, very short. And yes, there are issues with distortion and all kinds of other things, but there is an authenticity to recordings that are done this way. You know, when you listen to, and I don't know whether any of you do, when you listen to people like Caruso, or you listen to some of the great Martinelli, or any of the other great singers from that period, they were all recorded this way. They were not recorded with using any kind of electronics. It was purely mechanical and acoustic. And there is something about those recordings. They capture something that nothing we've done since captures. And that then begs the question, what is that? Why are we not, with all our fancy technology and our digital this and blah, blah, blah that, and our wideband microphones and all this sort of crap, why are we not catching this? Why are we not able to capture that? Because it is in the sort of phrasing and the sort of emotional content, if you will, from these recordings, that we don't pick that up with modern equipment. But nobody, I mean, I've spent lots of times in studios because I amongst a lot of the craziness I do, I act as acoustic advisor to a very famous conductor friend of mine. So I've spent dozens and dozens and dozens of hours at recording venues, listening to listening to the downplay, backplay from the recordings, listening to the individual microphones and all sorts of things like that. And the conclusion I come to is that we're really not doing a very good job here. You know, and this is in spite of the fact that his readings of the particular pieces of music that we're recording are actually quite phenomenal by any standard, historical or otherwise. But it's just that the document we're creating does not reflect that.
Right.
Does that make sense? Right. I can see that 100 million. Jesus. My glasses are not designed to read off the screen, so I'm going to have to sit and look at the screen. I mean, the question of subjectivity, I mean, to my mind, the subjective element is what kind of music you prefer, not what the sound should be.
Okay.
I see, you know, if you get music that you really like and the recording is really bad, I'll still listen to it. You know, I listen to music that goes back to the 1890s. And
wow.
I can tell you one thing, it's not a great sound, but the performance is definitely worth listening to. You know, being able to listen to Edward Grieg play his own Papillon in 1903, shortly before he died, that is a form of time travel.
Right.
Only form of time travel that any of us will ever do. It's the same listening to Shalyapin sing The River Maiden or, you know, whatever. That is what's so special about these old recordings, is that we can delve back into and listen to people that have gone many, many years ago, you know. And it's the same with, you know, listening to you know, David Saperton plays the Gudowski transcriptions of the Chopin etudes, or listening to King Oliver play, what's it called? Louis Armstrong did the best version of this, the girl that's lying dead in hospital. I can't remember what the bloody the name of the recording is, or the song is. And, you know, these things they have a value that goes far beyond this audiophile bullshit, to be perfectly frank with you. And you know, I see my job is really to make my audience, if you can call my customers my audience, understand the value of this by producing equipment that allows them to access it in such a way that they get the core musical message rather than just the noise from the 78. And the audiophile equipment will give you the noise, which is why people don't listen to recordings like this. So, have I been rude enough to everyone yet? I got
Okay.
a lot. Well, I can see there's a question here from Avinash. But this is what's so interesting. You see, if you read the early discussions, and particularly, I mean, I've only got the ones from EMI, but I know from a friend of mine who worked for Decca. He's passed away a few years ago, but I know from him that there were similar discussions within Decca in the UK. That really, when you have a sound field that's filled in properly, it's actually very difficult to hear the difference between stereo and mono. If you listen to really early early stereo recordings, you can take the Sonny Rollins Way Out West. On the original stereo version of that, you have the saxophone on the left and the drums and the bass on the right. That is stereo. Because they've just, Electric Recording Company has just re-released probably the finest re-releases ever done of Way Out West. And they purposely released both the original tapes in stereo, and they re-released them in mono. And these were done by different microphones simultaneously. The stereo is irritating to listen to because of the way it's recorded. The mono is much preferable. So I think, again, history is important here. It's important to understand history. You know, I study economic history as well. And again, you know, we're very good at forgetting things that don't fit our particular set of biases, for example. That's very common. In fact, I would say it's more common than not. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from history. In fact, we'd probably be better off studying a bit more history and a bit less technology.
Yes.
And to understand why things are that ended up the way they did. You know, once they started being able to record with multiple microphones, as we went through the 1960s, you can clearly hear a gradual, very, very gradual degradation of the quality of the source material. And it's, you know, I mean, this is one of my main interests in life, and I also happen to make it my living. So, you know, it sort of, it mixes itself very nicely there. I'll try and read one of the other questions. Okay, well, Arnaud's got this down to a fine art with his question. So it's a question that answers itself in a way. Atle, how about new recordings? Pre-80s recordings are the only ones worth spending time on. No, I wouldn't agree. I mean, I listen to a lot of, I mean, last night I sat and I listened to both Tool's albums, the last two albums, 10,000 Days and that other one that's got this weird name that I can't figure out, which is the most expensive CD ever sold. You know, $120 for a CD. That's and considering that he knocked Taylor Swift off the album chart in 2 days with sales of a CD that's $120, I find that quite amusing, actually. But then James Maynard Keenan is quite an extraordinary man. But it's I mean, I listen to all sorts of things. My Iranian distributor was kind enough to send me a huge amount of CDs with Iranian music, which I find fascinating.
Very, very beautiful.
A lot of that, and a lot of that goes back to the 1920s and 30s as well.
Mm.
You know, or to pre the current regime, like Qvortrup.
Mm.
And I just find all of this, I find it very stimulating, and I find it very interesting, and it also helps me, I think, take a much broader perspective on what it is we're supposed to do. So yeah, what can you say?
I have one point in continuation to what you're talking about, Peter. Like, you have been a very vocal critic of what you call as trendy and modern solutions to imaginary problems, or what you describe as a numbers game.
Well, the numbers game is again, it's again this. We have there is a tendency in modern culture, and I mean this is really Western culture adopted by India and China and Indonesia, and because you actually, if you look at your culture, it's a much more complex than what we present in the West. And a lot of this is, again, it's part of this mass marketing. If you study mass marketing, and of course we started with Edward Bernays in around the First World War. What you'll understand is that the more simple you can make the message, the more effective the message is. And in no area is this more common than with the numbers game. And the numbers game really doesn't matter. I mean, it started with low distortion in the late 1940s with the Williamson amplifier. It had 0.1% distortion. And all Williamson really did was apply more feedback successfully without destabilizing the circuit to an EL34 amplifier. And from there on, it then became, David Hafler came in with his 0.01. And then it's become, now we have so many zeros, you can't find the one at the end. And it's a nonsense, because the way we achieve it is by trickery. The underlying problems in these circuits are still there, and they're still audible. And I mean, as far as digital is concerned, I'll tell you a little anecdote. In 1992, I went to Japan with two journalists. One, because I wanted to publicize the collaboration we had with Audionote, and two, because I wanted them to write a little bit about the very different market there was for specialist audio in Japan compared to the West. Now, Sony found out that we were there. So they invited us to visit their R&D lab. And one afternoon we went there and walked around their lab, and we saw part of the factory, or one of the factories. They have several. And at the end of it, it was all very impressive. I mean, I would have hired most of the engineers that I met there in a heartbeat. They were fascinating. They really were. They had that sort of historic perspective, and they understood. Here were kids that were in their late 20s. Oh, I say kids, I'm 70 now. That's why I can say that. Otherwise, it would be offensive. No, but there were young people that had literally had maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years out of university. And they had a really good grasp of what went before, which was very interesting, because you don't get that out of the Western colleges and universities. What you get are kids that have, they can only look back about as far as it took them to get the education. And they don't really look back any further. But anyway, so at the end of it, we were invited to they had a bar downstairs where people would go and relax before they went home from work. And I'm thinking of doing that here because, but of course, if you have too much to drink, you can't drive home. Of course, in Japan, if you take the train, that has some benefits if you had a few too many. Anyway, but they had invited in the old engineer who had developed the 16-bit system. And we had a very interesting conversation. He was charming. And we had a very interesting conversation with him. And so we said to him, so I can't remember his name now, but let's say he was called Mr. Morikawa. Mr. Morikawa, so what do you listen to at home? I listen to classical music. Oh, that's very nice. So do I. Do you listen to CD or LP? And he sort of looked at us and he went, I listen LP. And in fact, he said, I listen only mono.
Okay.
So we said to him, okay, well, that's really interesting. So why not CD? And he leaned over the table and he said, LP for music, CD for commercial.
Wonderful.
And then I asked him, so how did you end up at the 16-bit system? Why 16-bit? And he said, 16-bit is the mathematical equilibrium between bandwidth, distortion, and noise. He said, you go up, you improve bandwidth, but you make the noise and dynamics worse. You go down, you reduce bandwidth, but you get better dynamics and less noise. Now, if you look at what happens when you increase the sound, what you do is you're shortening the word length. What nobody looks at is when you shorten the word length, you basically, when you have a 1 and then you have a 0, what happens is that you get a lot of noise at the top of each. And then we have all sorts of clever ways of trying to get rid of that. The fact of the matter is that you can't remove it. There are no systems that we are able to develop that work real time. They always reactive. They're like a servo. So they react to something that's already happened. Because in order to work real time, you would need to be able to predict what the signal is, the next signal is doing. There exists no technology that I know of that is capable of doing that. Which means that all the feedback systems and amplifiers that people use to get their great low distortion figures or high damping factor figures or whatever it is, and all the noise that's made about 24-bit and 32-bit and 384 or whatever it is, kilohertz sampling rate, it's all bullshit, basically, because you cannot change the fundamentals of the signal. The way they achieve these numbers is by trickery, you know. And
I'm sorry, please go on.
no, so basically, what the Japanese engineer told us, we can prove that to be true. We can it's quite easy to demonstrate that the 16-bit 44 kilohertz, that's as good as digital will ever get. And what you have to do is spend an inordinate amount of time and money on trying to, what should we say, show how much information is actually on these systems that are so antiquated now by modern technological standards.
I'll just go to the one question, which is from Mazban once again. And it's quite a, I know your answer for that.
Sorry?
Mazban is asking, uh, yeah. So the question is, which is better, solid state or waltz? I know your answer for that.
Really quite a good question here from Abhishek. It says here, depends on matches your speaker setup, transistor, MOSFETs, or valve-based. Every amp and speaker has different characteristics. Well, that's exactly the problem I described when I started, and that is the mix and match approach. What we do is we design the speakers to work with our amplifiers. We design the amplifier to do the same with the speaker. We do the same with the preamplifier versus the amplifier. So we look at, we call them gates, that the signal has to, when a signal passes through a circuit or any given part of the system, it has to jump gates. The lower you can make the gate, the more complete the passing of the signal is. And for us, and again, I think it's relatively easy to prove, for us, the fact that that we use transformers everywhere is a way of keeping the gate as low as possible. We do not use MOSFETs. We do not use anything else. In our top of the range products, we only use 1910 technology, i.e. directly heated triodes in as simple a configuration as possible. As I said earlier, it is one of the fundamental problems with our technological culture is the complication is looked at as being more clever than simplicity. We have an enormous capacity as a species for making things immensely complicated when they don't need to be.
So I still didn't get an answer to my question. Which is better, solid states or what?
Solid state is shit. I'm sorry. Solid state is completely unsuitable for music reproduction. Because
so it doesn't depend on what type of music you're listening to. I mean, suppose if you consider the newer age techno and extended deep bass, all synthetic sounds and synths and all that, wouldn't solid state be better off in that realm?
No. No. If you sat in my system, and if you ever come to the UK, you're very welcome to come and see the factory, and I'll let you listen to my system at home. When you hear my system at home, you will understand why I say this. There is nothing that solid state has to offer that has any validity in music reproduction. The only possible exception to that would be if you want to make a really, really cheap amplifier, then you would need to use solid state, so that the price versus quality balance is balanced towards price, not quality. There is absolutely no current or past transistor amplifier that can compete with a decent single-ended amplifier, with a directly heated triode. The only problem with that is that you don't get a lot of power, so you need relatively efficient speakers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But I'm still divided on that front, and especially since I come from more of the pro side of things, where we do like large format sound systems. I mean, WAVs just don't stand a chance there, and obviously that's because they're so low powered, and we really need much higher powers.
All you do, well, I mean, firstly, if we've supplied a few systems to studios here in the UK, and one in Paris. And one of the things that the recording engineers realized when they used our systems with our speakers and cables was that in order to hear what they felt they needed to hear, They didn't have to play as loud as they did on a transistorized system with very inefficient speakers. So I think what the problem you have as a recording engineer is that in order to raise the sort of the level of detail, if you can call it that, you need to play quite loud on a system with PMC speakers and whatever the amplifiers are in order to drive them. You don't need to do that if you use a 9-watt amplifier with a pair of our speakers that are 98 dB efficient. You will be able to hear what you need to hear at a much, much lower level because the sound is less contaminated.
Mazban, you also have another question, I believe, which you have asked about the frequency, the sampling, that 96 kilohertz.
Yeah, Peter. So you were talking about 16 kilohertz as being the perfect balance between between bandwidth and
16-bit 44 kilohertz.
Yeah, 16-bit 44, which is this Red Book standard. But but what I want to say is that today most studios offer 96 kilohertz recording capabilities as the go-to standard or the gold standard, and they say that there's a lot of air and you hear a lot of air and it really. It's especially more important in the higher frequencies that you can make out the difference of 96 kilohertz versus 16.
Again, I'll refer to what I said earlier, that I mean, when I go to studios, I have to say that I am appalled at how bad the sound is. I am absolutely astounded that you guys can even hear what it is you're trying to do. And so from that perspective, you get my applause, because I sure as shit can't hear at the levels that people work at in studios. I can't hear whether one thing is better than the other. It is, one, they play far too loud, and two, the sound is so contaminated in most cases that it's very difficult to hear. I did a recording session with my friend, my conductor friend is called Theodore Korensis. He's a Greek Russian. And last year, I attended a series of recordings we did, but there's one in particular where I spent quite a lot of time. And that was a recording of Beethoven 7, done at the Concerthaus in Vienna, with Theodore's own orchestra, which is called Musica Eterna. And there we managed to get a tape recorder to record simultaneously with the digital system, which is a 96 kilohertz system. And then we had some issues with the orchestra had been standing up for something like 8 hours. These Russians are tough, I tell you. For the violins and everyone to stand up for 8 hours while we're recording is just extraordinary. Anyway, they insisted on a break. So I went up to the monitoring room, and we did some listening to the scherzo of the third movement of I think it's the third movement of the seventh. And then I said to the producer, can we hear what we recorded on the tape recorder just for comparison? I swear to God, the first 2 seconds, in fact, the first 2 beats of the tape sounded so much better than this 96 kilohertz trash that we had listened to before, that the producer, who is a very famous and highly regarded Italian chap, he looked at me and he said, are you sure that the replay we got from the digital is not that there's not something wrong with it? And I said to him, no, this is what it sounds like. He had never in his entire career, over the 25 years that he'd been doing this, sat down and done a direct comparison between tape and digital. And this exactly proves my earlier point. History, history, history. If you do not know where you're coming from, you do not know where you're going. There's a famous joke in English where you stop somebody on the street and you say to them, "Can you tell me the road to Lincoln?" And they look at you and they go, "Well, if you want to go to Lincoln, you wouldn't want to start from here." Do the comparisons yourself, but you have to do it in systems that are complementary to the quality of tape. Because if you don't do that, all you're doing is doubling up on the mistake. It's really simple. I rest my case, as it were.
Peter, there's a question from Russell. Russell, can I request you to unmute yourself and ask the question directly? Maybe it'll be better if you can ask the question directly to Peter. Russell, if you can unmute yourself.
Well, what Russell is saying is that that altering that happens that you can see on measurements is a function of the way the measurements work, not the way the amplifier work. It's very simple. I think we got a break up now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. You know, this is a classic standard engineering complaint. Valve amplifiers have too much distortion. Okay, so let's set the levels and take a transistor amplifier with low distortion, measured distortion, and a valve amplifier. And we turn the volume up to a certain level so that the dB levels are the same. And then you make a judgment which one has the more distortion. And I can absolutely guarantee you that if you take one of my amplifiers and compare it to anything else in the transistor realm, you will hear more distortion from the transistor amplifier. So the question then is, what is it we're measuring if it doesn't express itself sonically? And the answer to that is that, as Einstein said when he was asked why we measure certain things, he said that, well, we measure what we know how to measure. We don't necessarily measure what is important, but we measure what we know how to measure. And any judgment based on measurements alone is utterly worthless. You know.
So the famous statement of Einstein is that not all things that count can be counted, and not all things that.
Exactly. I mean, but that is the problem that we've ended up with a sort of a technological cultural preference, or whatever you want to call it, that we think we can measure everything. I mean, nowhere is this more prevalent in mathematical economics.
Yep.
You know, it is so far removed from the empirical function of markets, but it is still used as the main way of judging how economies work.
You create mathematical models for everything. The Black-Scholes.
In 1882, a man called Burry wrote a book called Flatland, and the subtitle is a love affair in 2 dimensions. That eminently describes our technological preferences in audio, at least the measurement ones. I mean, you can't measure the difference between 2 resistors, but you can sure as shit hear them. You know, so if you can hear those differences, I mean, I can demonstrate something to you with, we make a turntable with 3 motors. With that turntable, we have 4 different power supplies. And so power supply 1, if you use conventional measurements, it measures exactly right. Power supply 2, use the same measurements, it measures the same way. 3 the same way, 4 the same way. When you move from 1 to 2, the sound from the turntable is clearly better. When you move from 2 to 3, there's a massive jump in performance of the turntable. These are the same motors going at the same speed with running a belt on the outside of the platter. We can't measure these differences, but I can tell you, I have yet to meet somebody who cannot hear those differences. Even somebody with a hearing aid I know could hear the differences. And that's even that's an extra set of amplifiers in between, and he still heard the difference. So there's so much we don't know. But you know, it's the, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger curve or the Dunning-Kruger effect. And really where the audio industry finds itself is that all the engineers are a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. They think they know a lot, but they know very little. So there you are. Welcome to the real world. I think we're running out of time now.
Yeah, we are almost towards the end of the session. Any further questions from anyone? In fact, there's an observation from Russell which says that a good example of what you're saying is the difference between an amp with an SMPS and one with a linear power supply.
Sorry, I'm trying to read some of the questions. What are my thoughts? I have field coil speakers. Let me finish with that. We are currently developing field coil speakers. This is a project that has sort of been, it's a bit of a stepchild project in a way, that it's sort of been come in and taken off and come in and taken off the agenda. I have the first prototypes at home. And I mean, I knew, because I've been playing with field coils in the late 70s and the early 80s. So I had a pretty good idea what the difference was. But to be honest with you, to be reminded 40 years later how superior a field coil is when it's done properly, is because we can do a direct comparison. We had the same drive unit with a ferrite magnet. We had the same drive unit with an Alnico, very high quality Alnico 5 magnet. And then we have a field coil. And it's in the same speaker, so we can do a direct comparison. We're not comparing an apple to an orange. We are comparing apples or oranges or pineapples or whatever the hell you want to call it. The superiority of the field coil is such, I mean, it's eye-watering how much better it is. It really is. And we're putting a major research effort now into looking at materials to see how far we can push that. You know, we got silver wire coming in to wind the coil that generates the field with silver wire, to see whether there's any difference between using copper wire or silver wire, or whether there's a difference between using copper plated aluminum wire, copper wire, and silver wire. This is how we work. We do very, very, very careful comparisons between materials, methods, processes, and so on, in order to be able to build a picture of where is the top of the curve. And the top of the curve can end up being very expensive, which is how we end up with some of these ludicrously expensive products we make. Okay. But to my great surprise, there are actually customers out there for $200,000 DA converters. you know, or $200,000 preamps, line preamps. So, you know, what would you know? But thanks for that question. I'd completely forgotten that. That's quite an important part of the.
Are there any other developments that you would like to speak about in terms of what's going to come out of Audionote?
We're in the process of developing or finalizing development on belt drive CD transports.
Okay.
We've discovered some things. The belt drive, the best of the versions we have, reduces the interference by the error correction circuit by about 25 times.
Okay.
So instead of having the motor doing all sorts of things and the error correction circuit sitting there doing this, the error correction circuit is doing hardly anything, and the motor is doing its job. We've improved the power supplies on the laser enormously. We're running belt drive on the laser as well instead of mechanical drive, a direct mechanical drive. We've got much better motor supplies, so the motors are not cocking like shit, etc., etc. I mean, there are a number of refinements there which we're still in the process of finalizing. We've got a discrete DAC coming out. It's not a ladder. It's a matrix, an MASC, and again we are finding that a lot of the theory that we read, the more modern theory that we read, is wrong. Yes, it measures better, and yes, it's faster, and yes, it's all this, but it doesn't actually work sonically. And I think one important thing to mention, certainly worth mentioning, which of course also is in terms of technological ideology, very difficult to swallow for most engineers, is that what we find very interesting is that the earliest technologies that are used in audio, i.e. the directly heated triode, 1911, the Forest, the very first loudspeakers, field coils, the very earliest digital to analog converter were discrete resistor networks of one form or another. You can take, turntables, the very early suspended turntables are still the best. You can then add more motors and so on, but that doesn't change the fundamentals of the design. That's just embellishing it and making it better, but still using the original idea. And so what's so interesting to me is that why is it that the very earliest versions of technology always, when properly applied, sound better than the later solutions? And it can only be because as we develop things, we develop them to cut cost. And when you cut cost, you cut quality. I can send you the most famous quote on this, which was by a man called John Ruskin in 1860. Where he talks about this, and I'll copy and paste it and send it to you. You can publicize it somewhere. Sure. And it really just perfectly describes where we are now. So yeah.
As early as 1860. Wow.
Pardon?
As early as 1860, someone is.
Ruskin was a sort of industrialist philosopher. He subscribed to the Robert Owen ideas of how you treated your workforce, for example.
Okay.
There's a very famous. It's almost like a town outside in Lanark in Scotland, where he tested a lot of his ideas. He's quite an important, he's largely forgotten now.
Okay.
Because of course you don't want to treat your workers very well, because that's not good for profit, at least not for short-term profit, or so they say. Both Owen and Roskin proved that it's not true.
Okay. There's one question which I think we should know. What are the importance of cables according to you?
Send it to us. Thanks, Arnaud. Arnaud, to everyone. There's hardly anything in the world that someone cannot make a little worse and sell a little cheaper. And the people who consider price alone is that person's lawful prey. And then you can read the rest for yourself.
So Masban is asking about the importance of cables.
Well, there's a question about the name of this record. I mean, all you need to do, if you can see the record,
yeah.
You see it? It's called Dimensions in Sound. And it's a conductor. He's actually a band leader, because he was mainly a jazz band leader, this guy called Bob Sharples.
Okay.
It regularly turns up on eBay. I have bought every copy that's turned up on eBay the last 2 years.
Okay.
I have a virtual monopoly on that and old valves.
Peter, there's a question by Masban which basically asks about the relevance of cables and how important are cables in the entire sound reproduction system. And the follow-up question is, does one need $100,000 cables to get better sound?
Well, I mean, if you spend $100,000 on my cables, you will get better sound. I'm not so sure about anything else. I mean, cables are very, very complex. As with most of the audio chain, the cables are part of a transmission line that starts at the stylus or the CD transport and that ends at the speakers. And unless the cable is able to not act as a high gate to the signal, and most cables do. Most cables are appalling. They really are. I regularly get customers come to me with super expensive, especially speaker cables, and I test them at home. And I mean, the degradation they cause is worse than a lot of active components. And that's hard to believe that that's even possible. How do you make something that's technically passive have losses of that magnitude? And you have to do a pretty shitty job, to be perfectly honest. But there you are. No, but to answer the question, no, you don't. You need cables that are dimensioned to suit the particular behavior of your system. And I mean, I can only really speak for what we do, and that is we make a wide range of cables precisely for that reason. That if you buy one of our cheaper systems, you just use one of the cheaper cables. And this is why we have a level system where we place the cables and the amplifiers and the speakers and so on within levels to make that easier for the customer. So that the customer can walk into the dealer with some understanding of what the recommendations are. And it's relatively simple. I mean, it's not, it's not really rocket science.
Okay. Are there any further questions from anyone else? Because we are running short of time, and in fact we have exceeded the time limits. But I'm open for one or two last questions if there are any.
Actually, just follow up to my question on cables. Peter, the reason for me asking about this is because many times in many shows and stuff we see people make really fancy claims that these cables are cold rolled and molecules are aligned to the magnetic north, or all that kind of stuff, and all this. Is this all bullshit marketing stunt, or does it really affect cables? I mean, because finally the cables are only a link from outside your speaker to outside your amplifier. What happens inside your amplifier? You're just using normal electrical wire to connect maybe the speaker terminals to the output of the valves, and probably normal electrical wire to connect the speaker terminals to the inside of the crossover. So how much of a difference is your bloody, you know, $1 million cables going to make when you've got electrical wire connecting your speakers to your connectors?
Well, I mean, you know, again, I can only speak for what we do. I mean, I know from like I said earlier, from playing around with some very famous both interconnects and speaker cables, that there are clearly losses in cables that are very difficult to explain when you, for example, measure them. And again, I think that tells us more about the deficiencies in our measuring systems than it tells us anything about the cables. I think the problem is that it's very easy to go, you know, there's this, you know, one of the fashionable things at the moment is to do this where you freeze everything down and to almost zero, absolute zero. And then that's supposed to do wonderful things to the crystalline structure in the cables. It probably does. I think it sounds, we've tried to do it with our cables, and I think it certainly makes the cables sound slightly different, but I don't think it makes them better. I think it just makes them different. And I'm not sure that a process that doesn't actually advance the quality is worth considering. I think, I mean, I've just lent, I don't know whether you know who My Bloody Valentine is, but we were contacted recently by Kevin, who is My Bloody Valentine. And he wanted to try some cables because he's building a new studio somewhere. So I've sent him some bits of cable, and I haven't heard back because I think partly because of COVID. But I know from playing with our cables in studios, for example, between microphones, that there are massive improvements to be had using a decent silver cable for microphones. That there is no good explanation why that may be. I mean, they don't measure that different from the copper cables that are normally used, but there is a very, very clear difference when you listen to a recording. Same microphone, same position. All you do is change the cable. You play the same piece of music twice, or the musician plays the same piece of music twice. You record it with the normal cable and with a silver cable, and there's a very, very obvious difference.
If I add one thing, Marsban, I mean, in the Audionote amplifiers, the cables we use internally for the speaker wiring, power wiring, for the signal wiring are also made by Audionote and are of the same type we use externally. So that is always what amazes me, that it is, you know, consequent throughout actually in the Audionote components. With each level, you get better internal wiring. That is, you know, you can just see that.
I mean, we are very, very, very thorough compared to anyone else in this regard. You know, we will use, you know, thin cables in places and thick cables in other places in order to balance the voice of a piece of equipment. And I mean, if you look at our bills of material, for example, they're incredibly complex. And the people that didn't build the amplifiers are following very, 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 I would say in some respects, difficult to follow instructions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it again, you know, it's like anything else. If you want to build the fastest car or the best this or, you know, the best that, you have to look at absolutely every single thing that may have an influence on the behavior. And it doesn't matter whether you're designing a piece of test equipment that's going to go to Mars and measure, you know, how many molecules there are in the atmosphere or whatever, or you're doing what we do. and it's not easy, but it takes a vast amount of dedication, a lot of time, and quite a lot of money to achieve a result that has any permanence. And I'll close on this. My plan has always been, and this sounds very arrogant, and because that's what it is. When I stop doing this and I retire, if I live long enough, that is, then I will have presided over making the best equipment that will ever be made, ever, by anybody. End of story. And whether you believe that or not is, of course, a personal matter. But the fact that we, as one of the few high-end manufacturers, have delivery times of in some cases a couple of years on equipment is testament to the fact that there are clearly more people out there that are willing to pay for it and wait.
Fair enough. Well said.
Well,
okay. Right, Peter. Thanks a lot.
You have to have a goal, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more with you.
Super ambitious.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up the session. Thanks a lot, Peter, for your time.
Well, I mean, just to close, anyone that's got any further questions are welcome to send me a quick email. You may not get a very quick answer, but an answer you will get.
That's great, Peter. Thank you. I think that Kartik has disappeared for some reason, but I would really like to thank you for this 1.5 hours of your life, and I really appreciate it. Again, thank you for having people ask questions to either Peter or send a question to me, info@audionote.in. I can forward the question if you like. In any case, thanks. I hope that 2-channel audio is here to stay. There are many developments also which we didn't talk about, which sometimes gives me the idea that it is going to disappear, but that has been said for many years and it's still there. And God bless Peter and Audionote for let us enjoying the music as it is intended to be. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Arnold. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.